Today we'll be looking at the history and a bit of a communism introduction with the Crucible. So when we take a look at the story of the Crucible, we combine the ideal of Puritanism with the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692, and we also combine a little bit of the 1950s with the idea of American McCarthyism and the author Arthur Miller. So let's start off with what Puritanism is. Puritanism is a Christian faith that originated in England during the early 1600s. Now, the biggest part of their religion was that they believed in predestination. Once you're born, you already have a fate. And so in order to make sure that you can make it to heaven, you have to live a flawless life. And so they were very strict when it came to the idea of if you're going to be living in heaven, you have to live that glorious life here on earth. Now, they split from the Church of England in 1633. They believed that the Church of England was corrupt and they wanted to purify their particular religion. Many emigrated to the American colonies, and their radical beliefs flourished in the New World. Since they were far away from king and country, they were able to kind of take over their own daily lives, and everything that they looked at, from local government to economy, everything was kind of run by the Puritan elders, the religious elders. So when we get to the early 1680s, 1690s, and of course the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692 is the most famous of the time, when we take a look at Puritans, the residents of Salem Village believed in witches and witchcraft. If you were going to have people who were God-fearing and were working out with the Bible to purify themselves, you must have good people, and therefore you must have truly evil people. They believed that witchcraft was entering into a compact with the devil in exchange for certain powers to do evil. And they considered witchcraft both a sin and a crime. It was a very serious accusation which was carefully and thoroughly investigated. So if you were performing witchcraft or accused of performing witchcraft, not only were you going against the Bible, but it was also against the civil law. So the witchcraft hysteria began in Salem, Massachusetts in early 1692. Now, when we start off with that, usually we take the idea of Reverend Parris's daughter and the niece, Abigail Williams, were starting to have fits of convulsions, screaming, and hallucination. And then after a doctor examines the girls, they conclude that the only explanation for these bizarre behaviors wasn't because the girls were seeking attention, it must be witchcraft. Now, a recently published book of the time detailed the symptoms of witchcraft, and the girls' fits were much like those that were described in the book. Therefore, the Puritans of Salem were very quick to believe the doctor's diagnosis. After all, they were going to be believing the elders, they're going to believe a sense of authority, and if the doctor had said it must be witchcraft, they're going to believe that. Now, of course, we need to know who created this sense of witchcraft, who was using witchcraft on them. Well, the girls pointed fingers at Tituba, who happened to be the slave in their home. And they also pointed at Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two members of the community who were lower income. They were not well looked upon by the community, so they're kind of outcasts. And these three women spark a witch hunt. Now, during the next 8 months, more than 150 people are going to be imprisoned for witchcraft. By the time court was dismissed, 27 people had been convicted of witchcraft, and 19 had been hanged and 1 pressed to death. Now, the hysteria that snowballed in Salem reveals just how deep the belief in the supernatural ran in colonial America. And so when we move then into the 1950s, we're moving almost 300 years later, we look a little bit at the sense of what can happen if we get a bit of a sensation like we did with witchcraft, just on a national scale. And that's when we look at McCarthyism. Now, McCarthyism is a term used to describe a period of intense suspicion in the United States during the early 1950s. It began when Senator Joseph McCarthy, a U.S. senator from Wisconsin, claimed that communists had infiltrated the Department of State. In other words, the U.S. government where we keep all of our secrets. A special House committee on un-American activities was formed to investigate the allegations of communism within the U.S. government. And during this period, people from all walks of life became the subjects of aggressive witch hunts, often based on inconclusive and even downright questionable evidence. Now, persons who were accused of being communists in the state government were often denied employment in both the public and the private sector. They were blackballed out of working. They were blackballed out of business. They essentially had lost their careers and all credibility. In another industry where we see a lot of communism accusations being thrown around, the film industry. There were over 300 actors, writers, and directors that were all denied work in the U.S., and many of them never worked in the U.S. again. Now, the American writer Arthur Miller was one of those alleged to have been blacklisted. So McCarthy's influence finally faltered in 1954 when his famous CBS newsman, Edward R. Murrow, aired an investigative news report which revealed McCarthy as dishonest in his speeches and abusive in his interrogation of witnesses. Now, we are looking at CBS News from 1954. People were going to give great credibility to the news at the time, and so Edward R. Murrow, what he says with his investigative reporting, people are going to believe he's a very credible source. And so the public was finally made aware of how McCarthy was ruining the reputations of many individuals through his false accusations of communism. So let's look at one of the people he went after, who is your author of The Crucible, Arthur Miller. In 1953, he wrote The Crucible, which uses the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692 to attack the anti-communist witch hunts of the 1950s. He believed that the hysteria surrounding the witchcraft trials in Puritan New England kind of paralleled, they was very similar to the climate of McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy's obsessive quest to uncover Communist Party infiltrations in the American institutions of government. Now, after the publication of The Crucible, Miller himself was investigated for possible associations with the Communist Party. So because he didn't like what was happening to other actors, other people in the government, he wrote The Crucible. And once The Crucible was published, all of a sudden Arthur Miller was being investigated. Now, he refused to give information regarding his colleagues and was found guilty in contempt of court. That means that he himself wasn't being accused of a communist, but he was being pressured to talk about his friends. Are your friends communists? Where did you get this idea for writing this particular play? And because he refused to say anything, he was found guilty of contempt of court. His sentence, of course, was later overturned. So now let's start looking a little bit more into The Crucible, the story itself, and take a look at the names of the real people and how they're portrayed in a fictional story from Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Starting off with Abigail Williams, she is the orphan niece of Reverend Parris. She was once the mistress of John Proctor, but she was turned out when his wife discovered they were having a love affair. So she's extremely jealous of Elizabeth Proctor, and she uses her power in the town to try to rid herself of Elizabeth as well as any others who have insulted her in the past. So she cries witchcraft on people that she does not like. Now, she cannot let go of her obsession with Proctor. That's why she wants to get rid of his wife. She's thinking someday maybe she can become his wife. And she's the leader of the other girls who are going to cry witchcraft. John Proctor, he is the husband to Elizabeth Proctor that we've already mentioned. Now, he did have a love affair with Abigail when she was employed in his household, but as soon as she is turned out, he tries to get rid of that love affair as quickly as possible. He realizes he's done wrong. Now, he knows that the girls are pretending. He knows that there's no such thing as witchcraft, but he can't tell what he knows without revealing that he has had an affair with Abigail. And, I mean, he's a Puritan. He does not want to admit to his sin. Now, when Abigail uses her influence to convict his wife, he tries to tell the truth. He decides, you know what, I will go ahead and damn myself in order to free my wife. He goes and he tells the authorities why Abigail is lying. They had an affair. So he finds himself condemned. Now, he refuses to admit to witchcraft or to consider Abigail as anything more than a liar. And so then, of course, he himself is hanged for his own condemnation. Now, Elizabeth Proctor is the wife of John Proctor. She discovered an affair going on between her husband and Abigail Williams, and she turned Abigail out of the house. After all, she doesn't want any sin in her house. She's Abigail's main target, but is saved from hanging because of her pregnancy, and she feels responsible for driving her husband to infidelity. She is a fairly cold woman, the way she describes herself. She's not looking for a very passionate love affair with her husband, and so she feels because she's not as passionate as her husband is, he turned to Abigail, and so she feels like she might have some of the guilt there. And then, of course, once John Proctor turns himself in and condemns himself in order to save her, the responsibility just keeps on growing. Tituba is a servant of the Parris household. She is a native of Barbados, and therefore she does not look and she does not have the same background as most of the others in the community. She is not a Puritan, and so therefore she is going to be one of the first who gets called out on witchcraft. She's enlisted by Ruth Putnam and Abigail to cast spells and create charms even before this point, however. But when Abigail turns on her to save herself from punishment, Tituba confesses to all and saves herself. After all, she's worried about her own life. If she declares herself as a witch and she wants to be saved from the devil, she can still continue living on. So she more than happily claims that she is doing witchcraft in order to save her own life. Now, the Reverend Parris is the head of the household where all of this begins. He is the pastor of the church in Salem. He is the father of Betty and the uncle of Abigail Williams, two of the girls who first cry out witchcraft. Now, he believes that he's being persecuted and that the townspeople do not respect his position as a man of God. He believes he should have more power and more sway in the town than he has. So when his daughter and his niece begin crying out witchcraft and it gives him more power in the town, he is more than happy to pursue witchcraft cries. So then we move on to the deputy governor, Danforth. He seems to feel particularly strongly that the girls are telling the truth. Again, superstition of the supernatural is quite a common thing in the early American colonies, and so therefore somebody in his high position as the deputy governor, he's going to want to look into the accusations. People believed that this kind of thing like witchcraft was going on. Now, he's sensitive to the presence of the devil, being a Puritan himself, and he reacts explosively to whatever evidence is presented. He feels that if he can root out the devil, he's going to save his people. So he believes what he's doing is right. But remember, he's also hunting after superstitions. So taking a look at the other girls besides Abigail Williams, we'll start with Betty Parris, who's the daughter of the Reverend and cousin to Abigail. She's a weak girl who goes along with her cousin as soon as she is threatened. So Betty does not have her own ideas or her own sense of confidence. Whatever Abigail says and does, we're going to follow along. Susanna Walcott and Mercy Lewis are going to be friends of the Putnam household and friends of Abigail Williams. Susanna is initially sent between Parris and Dr. Griggs to determine the cause of Betty's ailment, and she's easily guided by Abigail. So is Mercy Lewis, being a servant to the Putnam household. She's, however, a merciless girl. You can kind of see Mercy Lewis's name in Merciless, who seems to delight in the girls' activities. So while Betty and Susanna kind of follow along with whatever Abigail says, Mercy Lewis is going to be just as cruel as Abigail and call out a lot of people as being witches. Now, Mary Warren is a servant to the Proctor household. Now, Abigail uses her effectively to accuse Elizabeth Proctor. Again, Mary Warren, like most of the other girls, are going to follow along with whatever Abigail tells them. They're a little bit afraid of what Abigail might do to them if they don't. And Mary Warren certainly is influenced by Abigail Williams by fear. Now, John Proctor takes Mary to the court to confess that the girls are only pretending, but she's not strong enough to fight the fear of Abigail, and as soon as Abigail leads the other girls against her and are about to declare Mary Warren a witch, Mary caves in and runs back to her side by accusing John Proctor as a witch himself. So let's take a look at what the Crucible is itself, the idea of it being an American drama. Now, a drama is probably the most difficult form of writing because a play is not finished the same way that a poem or a novel is. After it's written, it still needs to be brought to life on a stage. Somebody needs to take that piece of work and present it. Now, a play primarily engages the enthusiasm of directors, actors, and technicians throughout the story, so it takes a lot of people and a lot of work to bring the one story together. Now, the playwright, the person who writes the drama, makes the audience concerned for a character by focusing on the conflict, the plot line that involves something important to the characters, and the protagonist in the play, the main character in the play, is going to drive the action forward. Now, the exposition gives the audience background information. In particular for the Crucible, there's a lot of characters. You need to understand why the sense of witchcraft and superstition is flowing throughout this community. So you get the background information and history from the characters through exposition. And most of the plays that are produced in the United States today are produced with the hope that they will make money. So you have a tendency to see extremely plot-driven lines. Now, playwrights must usually find an agent who submits a play to producers who are likely to consider it. And so when we look at how a drama or how a movie or a television show is produced, you're thinking about profit. You're looking at what we can do in order to make it exciting, in order to make people want to spend money in order to see it. So that's where the producer comes in. The producer advances money to actually finance the play, to create the play, and they meet with agents who represent the playwrights, and they work with the playwright on changes to the play. So a lot of times, even though you have a playwright who's created the play, the producer overall is the one who's making sure it gets an audience. Now, the theater is a collaborative medium. We talked about not only the producer and the playwright, but you've got directors, you've got actors, you've got stagehands. Everybody needs to come together all at once in order to produce this particular story. And rehearsals are both pleasant and tense. Producers seldom take risks on plays. And so there's a lot of times when you take a look at the story such as The Crucible, which gets a little bit of hype because of the plot line and the fact that there is a little bit of history behind it. Somebody like a producer is going to want to produce this play. Thousands of plays are copyrighted each year, and the audience can contribute to a good performance. If you are actually going to go see a play, you are actually helping out by being an audience member. The director and the actors of the play are responding to the audience and how they react to what they're seeing on the stage. Well, that will do it for your introduction to The Crucible with its historical introduction. It's a little bit of McCarthyism and communism and a little bit about the author themselves. I hope you enjoyed this. If you'd like to learn more about The Crucible or about something else, please leave me a comment. Let me know what else you'd like to learn. I'd sure appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. Thanks for stopping by.